welcome, welcome, welcome. It occurred to me today that this day that is dawning is in some ways the same experience of a day dawning that our ancestors experienced, our ancestors long ago and our parents and grandparents more recently. If you are able to see the outside from wherever you are, just take a glimpse of the outside. Here in DuPage County, it is overcast, but it is nonetheless a day, a wonderful day, like so many others, and yet a brand new one. And imagine how our ancestors awakened to a day just like this. And they may have looked at the sky and given thanks for the day itself and for all the opportunities to love and be loved, to be a full divine human being in this day. So we give thanks for this day and for this gathering of God's people. I'm going to turn it over to our senior pastor, my colleague, Jeff Braun.
Good. Thank you, Jeffrey. Good morning, everybody.
Morning.
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 If any of you are drinking coffee this morning, take a sip from me. I sat down and realized there was one thing missing from my morning routine. It was the coffee. So, prayers upon me. Maybe our ancestors woke up that way one morning and thought the same thing. But the conversation will be extremely stimulating this morning. And so we're so excited to be together again. Part 2 of our conversation with LeAnn Pope. And with her special supporters, again, drawn into our fold as we talk about her master's thesis, From Colorblind to Clearer Vision, and a white Christian's unexpected journey toward redemption. And last week, we really talked a lot about, we delved into her paper and we engaged questions about the economic, the social, even the real estate realities, the various systemic realities of racism, how that has played out through time, been perpetrated through time, and engaged questions on that front. We wanted to take it just in a little bit different direction today, branching off of last week, but now really trying to look at this topic and to self-reflect through a theological lens, through the lens of where is God in this and where are we in light of what God is asking of us. And so we wanted to open with a question to LeAnn and then have some questions that you'd be able to ask her, prompted by this new direction. And then a little bit later, as Jeffrey, I think, indicated, we're going to have breakout sessions where we're able to talk about a given question in small groups and then come back and report on what those conversations were, which is always a very rich way to engage a topic. So LeAnn, to open up this morning, in your thesis, and this is toward the end of this thesis, but it's certainly woven through the entire thing, you lead up to this, you accurately state how many people, including many Christians, can perceive racism as a political issue, something that plays out in the political realms, it is to be dealt with in political ways. And you also state that for the longest time, and even after you felt personally drawn to try and better understand and even address this issue of racism, and more broadly systemic racism, that you felt so-called political issues didn't belong in church, didn't belong coming from the pulpit, but didn't belong in church. How has that view changed, and what led to that change for you?
Thank you, Jeff. It's the last chapter of my thesis where I explore why church. Why are issues of social justice and equity and inclusion, why are they matters of the church and matters of the gospel? And I start out with, again, a confession, a humble confession. And that is, for many years, I believe that issues of racism and race were political issues, and political issues do not belong in the pulpit. I believe this very firmly. I'm a baby boomer. I see many of you on the call are baby boomer generation too. Perhaps you were also raised in a predominantly white Christian church where there was a sense that issues of social justice were politics and you didn't raise those from the pulpit. I know that I'm not the only one who was raised this way, because I've talked to an awful lot of folks. And most interesting, if you have not read Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from the Birmingham jail from 1963, I strongly suggest you do it. I read it for the first time when I was in seminary. And Martin Luther King Jr., when he was in jail, he was castigating his fellow white preachers because they were saying to Martin Luther King Jr., just, slow down, this will happen in due course. And Martin Luther King Jr. said, your theology has always been so strange to me. Why is it that you can separate the soul from the body and the sacred from the divine? He said, you all have a different theology than we do. So when I read this, I knew that I wasn't operating in a vacuum. And I bet a lot of folks who grew up in mainstream white Christian churches were thinking the same way. We certainly believed in charity. We certainly believed that we were charged to clothe the poor and to feed the hungry. We believed that. But we never were taught to believe that we were also charged to take down the systems that keep people poor. You see, on the one hand, you have charity. On the other hand, you have the work of justice to keep people from being poor. So I never thought that way. It changed when I started at school at Garrett. Now, in seminary, they actually require you to read the Bible. And I don't mean to be flip when I say this, but think about it. When you're in church, you hear the lectionary scripture. And many of us, me included, I was kind of on autopilot for years. I go to church, faithful church attender. I hear the scripture from the lectionary, little tidbits here and there from the gospel, from the Old Testament, from Paul's letters, but I never put it all together. I truly was on autopilot for years until I started reading the Bible for the first time in many, many years. And when I started reading the stories, and I'm talking now the gospel stories, when I started reading these stories through fresh eyes, yes, I still saw Jesus healing people, feeding people, making people whole. But here's what I missed for years. When Jesus was doing those things, he was crossing boundaries. He was a boundary crosser. And what do I mean by that? Just as we have systems today that set people in a hierarchy, we have people on the top and people on the bottom. That's the way that our world, for some reason, humans have created it that way. In first century Palestine, they had similar issues like that, very important issues, but they were ruled by the Judeo law. And the Israelites at that time were very focused, because this was the law of Moses, on two things, purity and holiness. And they had all these rules that they had to follow to maintain purity and holiness. Well, now, what were some of those rules? Number one is, if your body is not whole, if your body is broken, if you are a leper, if you are crippled, you are shunned. You are put outside the walls of Jerusalem. You are in the margins. What did Jesus do when he reached out to the lepers, to the crippled, to the blind? Not only did he heal them, he touched them and brought them back in. Brought them back in a way that honored their humanity, like the humanity of the whole, someone who was whole in body was honored. Another way that people can be unclean is through blood. Women who were bleeding on a monthly basis had to go sequester themselves. Think about the story, the Good Samaritan. We all know the story, the Good Samaritan, but let me remind you of something. The story opens up with a Levite and a priest walking down the road, and they see this man who is beat up and is laying in a curb, in a gutter, bleeding. Now, we all know that they just kept walking by. We know the story. But they didn't just keep walking. They crossed the street. Read the story again. They moved to the other side of the street. And why did they do that? Because the guy was bleeding. And they could not, under their rules, if they touched him, they would be impure. And that's what Jesus was pushing back. That was a system of oppression for people who were pushed to the outside of society. Jesus, when you read the gospel through this lens, everywhere he goes, he's holding his hand out. He's touching the woman who is bleeding and who is touching the bottom of his robe. And he reaches out to her. He doesn't shun her. He sees the leper. He touches the leper. And this is what made the priestly caste crazy about Jesus, because he was breaking the rules. And you don't break the rules that keep society in their place. When I finally started to realize that the ministry of Jesus was all about justice, was all about breaking down these barriers that kept people outside and therefore considered less human, his ministry was to bring us all into the middle of Jerusalem. And so that everyone was seen as fully human. Everyone was seen as created in the image of God, the Imago Dei. That was Jesus's ministry. To me, that is Jesus of Nazareth. And I remember saying this to Jeff in school. I actually got to know Jesus of Nazareth for the first time. I always felt growing up that I knew the divine Jesus. My relationship with Christ was the post-resurrection Christ, the Christ who sits at the right hand of God in heaven. My faith was always, it was a vertical experience for me. I'm here, God and Jesus are up in heaven. And it was very a silo-esque faith practice. But when I realized what Jesus really wants us to do is to look down on earth and to see how he behaved when he was on earth. What better way to see how God expects us to treat each other than to see how Jesus demonstrated how we should treat each other? And what that means is to be a boundary breaker, to break down those boundaries that keep people out, to break down those boundaries that force people into a place in society that is lesser than other people. And that's why I have gone from racism has no place in the pulpit to, I so firmly believe this, we cannot be church without social justice. So indeed, it was a big transformation. And please don't misunderstand me. I still love the divine Christ. It's a both and. But what I realized I was doing is I was so focused on the divinity of Christ, of the heavenly Christ, that I looked past what Jesus of Nazareth was really trying to do during his ministry. And that's why they murdered him. That's why he was killed, because he was pushing back against all the rules and the laws, and you're not supposed to do that. So I have a whole new, oh, by the way, let me say, you don't have to go to seminary to read the Bible. I encourage you, open it up and just start reading. Take it from the beginning of a book. Start with the Gospels. Open it from the beginning and just start reading. If you want to order one of the study Bibles that we all use, that I know Jeff still uses for his sermons, in seminary, order a study Bible. It has little, cheat notes at the bottom of it that we all appreciate and rely on. I don't always disagree with them, that's for sure, but they're helpful. So I encourage all of you in this journey to open up your Bibles and to start reading, and through your fresh eyes, you never know what you might see.
Thank you, LeAnn, for your opening thoughts, and want to open it up to see what others are thinking, what's moving in them, what's moving in you, responses to what, or questions for what LeAnn is saying, or just engaging this topic.
And remember, you can put any questions, comments in the chat, raise your hand physically, or use the reaction buttons at the bottom. If I can't see you and you want to speak, you can maybe unmute yourself and just speak. Yes, Marcy?
LeAnn,
Yeah.
coming at what you've said and then your thesis, which was so thought-provoking, I'm an activist, so I'm struggling with how your message of who Christ wants us to be can go forth, either within the church or to little kids and to others. So I'm looking for steps that we all can do once we understand the message that you're giving us. What next can we do?
So Marcy, that is a very good question. And in fact, we are going to address that at the very end of this session because WCC does have a plan.
Good.
And we do have a plan. I mean, we all know each other. We know our congregation. We're not just going to sit here and chat about it and then go back to our daily business. So would you allow us, please, Marcy, just to hold that question until we get to the end?
Sounds good.
Okay, thank you.
Paul, I know you had your hand up.
Yes, I had entered a question last week we didn't have a chance to get to, but question is it possible to be white and not be a racist? And follow-up, is it possible to be black and not be a racist? It's so inbred in us that I'm just not sure innately if we aren't all racist, period.
Paul, I will give you my answer. If you're asking me the question, I speak only for myself, but I'll tell you how I feel about it. I don't think we can be, I think it's very hard. First of all, I don't believe in absolutes. It's very hard to be white and not be a racist. I thought I was not a racist. I now know that being a racist, means that you treat all people, you consider that they have the same attributes based on the color of their skin. Now, have I ever thought about African Americans as all possessing a certain attribute because of the color of their skin? Yes, I have. I recognize it now, and I push back against those thoughts. So yes, I consider myself a racist, but I also don't use that word an awful lot because it is a trigger word for so many white folks. And then when we start arguing about whether or not we're a racist or not, because I've been through this before, that allows us to not address the issue that we have to address, and that is, how do we break down the systems that are keeping people down? In other words, it allows us to take our focus off what has really happened over all these millennia, all these centuries, and not focus on the work that needs to be done. But Paul, I understand what you're saying. I really, really do. And I can't answer the second part of the question because I'm not Black. So I don't want to even try to answer that.
I guess if we don't call ourselves racist, can we really recognize what we need to do to fight against that innate sense? It's, if we don't use that term, I think we're kind of misleading ourselves. So
Yeah.
I'm not so sure we shouldn't use the term.
Yeah, no, and I'm not saying I don't, certainly you've heard me say it. I use it a lot, but I don't focus on it because I've already moved past the point of, yeah, I already think I'm a racist. And I think it's hard to be white and not be a racist. I've been there and I've moved past it. I've accepted that. So you and I think are saying exactly the same thing.
I just think a lot of people refuse to acknowledge that they have those feelings and
Yeah.
that they're just there. And if you don't acknowledge them, if you don't force people in some ways to confront them, then I'm not sure we're really making much progress.
Yeah.
So
Paul,
I think we need to sometimes get in people's face to some ways about this.
And get in our own face about
Yeah.
this. Certainly scripture is a mirror and Christ is the mirror holder often. And I heard something, what you said as well, Paul, that was interesting. To me, it was a question of hope. not just a question of accountability or honesty, but a question of hope. If it is not possible, speaking just for someone who's white, me, and I'll extend it more broadly, if it's not possible for someone who's white to not be a racist, ... So what hope do we have to defeat this thing called racism? Is it dependent upon our individual ability to get beyond all bias? And I think that sort of sounds like that's the implication, but we can recognize we're always going to fall short and still be about the work. We can recognize we can't do it on our own. We need Christ, we need God's help to do the work, and then still engage with it, even if we'll always personally fall short. So I think it's an important question to ask in terms of understanding that we may never, any one of us, be able to get to an utter absence of bias. Is that even possible for a human being? But that doesn't mean that we're not called to the work and can't accomplish the work, in part by way of what God can bring to the mix and the Holy can add to the mix that makes us more than we would be on our own. So I heard a question of hope embedded in your very thoughtful question as well. And I think it's one that's important we engage.
Right, no, very good point.
I think that we can take lessons from the younger generation. I've noticed that when I listen to my granddaughter, she never refers to somebody by race. And yet in our generation, I'm the oldest generation of this in this church, people tend to define people by their race. If they're talking about somebody, they will refer to them perhaps as African American. And that's not true of our youngest generation. So I think we could take lessons to them that we shouldn't always think in terms of race as we define people.
Yeah, Nina, I think that is such an important point, and thank you for raising that. And it seems in the younger generation, I agree with you, do better than we do with this. But one of the ways that I see at the heart of this anti-racist work is to get to the point that we no longer see ourselves as through race, the lens of race, but through the lens of humanity. And then that's the goal, to no longer see somebody because of the color of their skin, through the color of their skin, by the color of their skin, but to see them as humans. So I absolutely understand what you're saying. And, thank you for bringing that up.
Could I also add, I think going back to what you were saying, Paul, that racist, although there is something to admit to oneself that you have racist ideas, I don't necessarily think that makes you a racist. You might not act in very racist ways or what we traditionally would consider a racist way, but there are policies or structures in our society that are racist that I never questioned or saw, and was working within.
Right.
That maybe make me a racist. And to be an anti-racist, I need to look at those things and question how they are harming other groups or make other groups, all the same or put them in a box, I guess.
Great point.
Yeah.
Great point. Greg.
Also, yeah, I think,
Thank you,
again,
Jim.
Paul has brought up a really good question. It made me think. We can think about ourselves individually and what Jesus has allowed us to do to look inward at our own souls. But beyond saving ourselves, there's this social aspect. And not, am I a racist? Is he a racist? We live in a racist society. And other than the things we can do for our own souls, internally, there's a lot of things from not just Jesus's words, but his actions and how it's inspired, millennia of other societies to help people other than themselves, our communities, our nations, the whole world, maybe to make this a better place. And the things that we did with our lives and the things that this church can do to affect other lives in, that all political persuasions can agree is a good thing for the greater community. That's what LeAnn's message is. It's resounding for me.
Thank you,
I think
Greg.
Flurry has a question.
Let's take Flurry's question, and then after that, we're going to pivot to our breakout group questions, and Jeffrey's going to assign the group. So, Flurry.
I heard an interview with it was on Fan, and maybe some of you heard it several months ago now. But Robin DiAngelo, who wrote White Fragility, was interviewing the assistant principal of Evanston High School, who is a black man, and Robin DiAngelo is a white woman. And he said in the course of the interview, when he hears people say, well, I don't see you as black. I see you as, just like I am. And his response was, you have to see me as black. Otherwise, you cannot understand what I go through in my life when I walk into a store or when you walk into a store. Those are two different realities. So you have to see me as black so that you can understand the racism that goes on in in our country, because most of our systems have been structured by white men, not black men, not Asian people, not Native American. So they were sort of put in place from our point of view and to benefit white people.
Yeah, that what he is essentially saying is, that's the argument that, well, I'm colorblind, I don't see color. That's its own form of racism. It really is.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Should we go into breakout groups?
Yeah, we're going to pivot now to breakout groups. Just quick reminds me of that statement. If you ask a fish, how's the water? The fish would say, what water? And I think there's an element of that here that's teased out by what Flurry said in the conversation between the Evanston High School principal and Robin DiAngelo. And as whites in a system that's structured to benefit those with white skin, it might be the what water. And I think that's back to what Jean was saying too. So we're going to pivot now, and Jeffrey's going to assign these breakout groups. We're going to be in those groups for about 5 or so minutes, and then we're going to come back and want to be able to share some of the fruit of those groups. We won't be able to get to everyone, but we want to hear what came up in those conversations. And so the question we're going to ask you to engage, because this is really the question that we're talking about today in this theological way, is, do you agree that anti-racism work and advocacy, trying to advocate for change, is the work of the church? And why not? Are you strongly in favor of that? Why are you opposed to that? Somewhere in the middle. But is this the work of the church, trying to address this issue of racism on a personal way and in a systemic way? And so Jeffrey's going to assign the groups. Again, we'll be there for a few minutes. We'll draw you back, and we want to share when you get back what you were talking about.
Our time in the groups will be about 7 minutes. Some groups will have 3, some will have 4. You do need to accept that you're being sent to a breakout room. Otherwise, some groups will wonder, where's my other people? Here we go.
Are one of the biggest things we need to deal with. And I think that the church, as part of the whole society, of course, needs to deal with it. And because I agree with everything LeAnn has said about social justice, and social justice issues are the reason I'm still part of a church, our mandate that we deal with racism.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll let somebody else talk.
And Pat, you're on the line here. You remember when we went to Dubuque, we had a certain element of distrust with these bunch of Danes coming from Nebraska to Wartburg Seminary, because Wartburg Seminary was for the Germans. That was German theological school, not Danes. Did
you have any blacks?
No, no, we sure didn't. Yeah. So you're a product of that, and of course we are too. Patty is commenting here, right here, is that she's a product of the same thing. I mean and I mean Harlan, Iowa.
It was interesting when the black was saying you can't see me as other than black because then you don't understand what I'm going through.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess I agree with that to an extent. But wouldn't it be nice if we could all see each other not in the context of color?
Yeah, Patty, that's true, which is where we want to go. But I know what he was saying is, if you erase my blackness, you are not going to see me for who I am. See, white folks don't look at each other and see a race. It's like we don't have the race. Everyone else has a race. The Asians, the blacks, the Latinx, everyone else is raced, but we're not raced. So
white people are distinguished by ethnics, by your ethnic group.
Yeah, but not as much today, Patty, as it was, 60, 70 years ago.
70 years ago, right? Exactly.
Everyone's kind of been whitewashed right now. You're either white or you're, Latinx or black or Asian.
Right.
Yeah.
And so I really understand what he's saying, because.
So so the interesting question is, how do we get to the point? I mean, it's going to take a lot of work. I know that. But how do we get to the point where we don't identify people by their skin color? And that we're all just
I don't think that that's going to first of all, I don't think it's going to happen in my lifetime. I don't think it will happen in my lifetime. But what will help tremendously is when we start narrowing the socioeconomic gap, the wealth gap, healthcare gap. When we start behaving like we are all humans together, and we narrow these gaps, I think that's what we have to work towards, is narrowing the gaps, the wealth gap, education gap, healthcare gap.
Right.
I mean, I don't even know if my kids are going to see it in their lifetime, but I don't want to be the generation where we just let it go and didn't do anything.
Exactly.
Yeah. What has been the general mood in your congregation on all of this?
Dad, I've been really surprised, because they've been very receptive to this.
Really?
Yes, and you see the age demographic, Dad. It's we're not a young congregation.
It's a generational thing.
Yeah, and they have been very, very receptive, very receptive.
Yeah.
And that's what gives me hope. Because
we witnessed the same thing here at Emmanuel. Is that I remember the first time we had a baptism where a black family was there, and that was just within the last year.
Yeah.
And the baby was a mixed racial, was a white girl with a black African American man.
Yeah.
I mean, and that's you talk about a generational thing. I mean, and I think you're right. You probably won't see the results of it even in your lifetime, and certainly not in ours.
Yeah.
But hopefully it will be more evident in our grandchildren's. And we have quite an age span in grandchildren. So maybe our older grandchildren may see the beginning of it, but possibly the younger ones might see it more.
Yeah. I do think, and what Nina was saying, the younger generation, they're just better at this than we are.
They are.
Yeah.
They are.
They're just better at this, which is really, really good. Now, that doesn't mean that all we have to do is get to their generation and then we're going to be okay. I don't think that's the case at all.
No.
But I do think the younger generation is much better at this than we are.
Welcome back, everybody.
So we wanted to share the fruit of that time. And Jeffrey and I are going to just do our best to call on folks, but who would like to share what came up in your conversation? We're going to take about 10 minutes or so, maybe a little bit more to process this. And we want to hear what came up.
I think we were pretty much in agreement that talk about civil rights and race and all those topics are natural topics for a church. And all of us were very comfortable. I don't want to speak for JS and Andrew, maybe they'd want to chime in, but I was talking about how in my Methodist church in Dearborn, Michigan, it was taken for granted that those are topics that we would deal with. We were talking
You pretty
about
much said everything we talked about. Yes, I felt the church was a place where we can come in and intervene as long as we are not pushing a particular church doctrines, but then we are going and seeing things on a human level and relating everything on the same line as humanity, but not imposing the church's doctrine, pushing it with that.
Thank you. Other
question that we agree that the church should not be bashful about addressing these issues, but I think also the church does many things and is there for many reasons. I mean, the church is there to minister to us, to take care of our cares and needs and all the things that go on in our daily lives. So the question is, well, what does it mean for the church to address these issues? Are we going to talk, is that going to be the sole substance of the church? That's a tough question. I think we concluded that maybe the most important thing is to kind of keep nudging us along so we all do those little things that at the end of the day might make a big difference. So we may not be out there marching, we may not be activists in front of legislatures or something, but if we all increasingly do the little things to fight racism and get pushed from the pulpit and elsewhere to do that, that's what we should be doing.
But I just also would make the point that I think if the church is going to increase its relevance in 2020s, we have to do this, that this is going to appeal to the younger generation. We oftentimes whine about how poor attendance is of younger generations in the institution generally. And I think that we will make ourselves more relevant by speaking more directly to these issues.
Yeah, if there's a mantra, if you might want to call it a DNA thread within the millennial generation, for sure. It's not that it isn't elsewhere. It's don't talk the talk, just walk the walk, and that's what we want. So Liz, let's go to you.
Thanks, Jeff. So my group was Steve Hewells and excuse me, and Jen. And we're all on our green team at the church. And so we found the parallels with sustainability. And there really are some in terms of it being an issue that's appropriate for a ministry, for advocacy, for conversation. It links, we think, 100% with racial issues. We've been talking about it in our green team and the need for environmental justice and racial justice. But also that, and there, honestly, I thought about it. I didn't get to articulate this, but there's a similarity to sort of the individual and collective action. And again, the sustainability is a good comparison. We feel overwhelmed in the face of this. We're not sure what what each one of us individually can do to make a difference, but we have power, and that's what we do. We act individually. We come together in these groups to expand that power and voice and carry it forward. And so we feel strongly that this is a matter for our church and others. And real quick, I'll say I wasn't able to attend last week, but I did watch the recording and to go what other people have said. My son is 18, and 3 years ago, he showed me a video called Adam Ruins the Suburbs. It's a series. Adam is a guy who goes behind the curtain and sort of illuminates a light on things. And this, I'll put a link in the chat in a minute. I'm having technical issues, so I have to, anyway, as soon as I stop talking, I'll put it in. But it's a 6-minute video that explains in the best way, most accessible way possible, how redlining works. And I think going back to those of us here in Winnetka and this church in this area, if you have trouble recognizing any aspects of racism within us individually, at the very least, we need to recognize we're the beneficiaries of this very racist system. We are the cream of the crop in this, and the property taxes and the redlining, and we are winners in this system. And so I think we're all hopefully realizing it's incumbent on us to do something about that, and not just sit and talk the talk, but walk the walk and do something different.
Thank you, Liz. What came up in some of the other groups? We certainly want, these are great conversations, but we want to share, weave that into the broader fabric. So is there another group that would like to just share something that was communicated in your session?
Go ahead,
let's go Andrea and then Jean. Thank you.
Okay. I was in a group with the Gillettes and then Madge again. And I think, I think we had consensus that we like groups like this to discuss in detail some of these heavier issues. And from the pulpit, I think this was Ray and Susan more specifically said, if you talk about the lessons in the Bible and you make that the essence of, the foundation of your sermon, and then just touch on how that's applied to everyday life and what areas that touches on, whether it's a bad criminal justice system or racism or what have you, but not necessarily make the whole sermon about a particular topic. I personally feel that this is a much better forum for talking about some of these heavier issues, because actually on Sunday morning, it's nice to go in and to feel good when you leave the service, but also have something to be able to really ruminate about and consider. And if you touch on the areas that it's important to apply these lessons to, then let us figure it out. But to do it from the pulpit sometimes feels, well, no pun intended, but preachy, and doesn't necessarily leave us feeling, it leaves you feeling stirred up, but not necessarily peaceful at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
It really is. If you think about, the Gospels are based on social justice, and many of them are. And if the gospel we're hearing about is based on a social justice issue, we should walk away contemplating how that affects us on our daily lives. It is not maybe for an every week sermon, but it is certainly for the lessons learned in the gospel and how it applies to our daily lives.
Mm-hmm. And that rubber meets the road piece is just so key.
Well, and we really feel strongly that love is the most important thing that we can offer to the world. And as a church, as people of God.
If Jesus' teaching was all about inclusion and social justice, he also didn't just teach about it, he acted on it. And I think, at least personally in my life, I've been educating myself about this for a long, long time. And I think we need to move into action as well, which I find harder to do in our very white suburbs, and would look forward to hearing what the church wants to do, how we can get involved in action. And even though we still have a lot of educating of ourselves to do, but I'd like to move into action too.
Thank you, Lynn. Jean.
Lynn, that's an excellent segue or connection to what Junie and I were talking about in our group, which was sort of actions that, how do you find the actions? How do you do actions in a way that move people along, whether it's in our communities or other communities? And I remembered back to the, push for low-income housing in Winnetka that was squashed. The work that was done after the walk there's a gentleman who, this was the walk after George Floyd was killed in Winnetka, and there were people who were talking about it. There was a man of color, a Black man who lives in Winnetka, who felt like he was treated as a service worker, and no one really wanted to befriend him. So there are many levels that we can work on, but we do need to figure out a way to work forward.
And I add one word to that too,
Mm-hmm.
that Jesus,
Please.
we were also taught that we are the hands and feet and bodies of God. And that we need to do the action, as you say, Lynn, to make a difference. So I think advocacy is wonderful. Study, learning, talking, discussing, and acting.
Any last comments from our sessions? These obviously were very rich, and I would love to have spent longer in them, but appreciate your willingness to jump back in and talk in the main group so we can share. So it might make sense to just share now. We want to come back to that question that Marcy had asked, and thanking all of you for Jean just said, a perfect segue. This is a perfect segue into talking about, so what can we do? And just to think theologically for one moment, we think about what LeAnn had said about sort of that very vertical relationship of my relationship with God, and yet I don't want to talk about necessarily some issues of the world. I want to keep those walls up, and putting the arms on the cross. If you think of our individual connection with God as that vertical of the cross, what are the arms, the love thy neighbor piece, and what does that require of us in thought and in word and in action? And tying into that idea of embodiment, if we are the body of Christ, his hands, his feet, his eyes, his ears in the world, then how do we embody what he asks of us and thus heal the broader body of which we're a part? Again, going back to something that many of us have said in this call and LeAnn has said. So to that point, and very much wanting to be about a process of moving toward action that is grounded in who we are as a church, which is a capital C congregational church, where there is process, there is thoughtful reflection and prayer, but then action and collective action. I have called together and have asked LeAnn to lead an anti-racism advocacy working group. And the purpose of this group, which is completely formed of members of our congregation, I'll be working closely with it, but technically I am not on it, advising and standing beside it. The purpose of this group is to come up with a process and a proposal for a process of how our church can move thoughtfully to action, to advocating for the kinds of changes that we are saying are grounded in the scripture, grounded in what Christ is calling us to do. And they will then make that recommendation to council, true to our process, so it can be thoughtfully engaged by a broader ring. And also integral to this is that the congregation, you, other members of our congregation, will be engaged. You will be involved in this process of discerning how can we concretely move toward action and advocate for the kind of changes that we are talking about, which certainly were what Jesus were asking us to be about. And so the group has been formed. LeAnn, again, is taking the lead. Their next step is to make a presentation to propose something to council for it to be vetted and thought about there. And then it's going to come out to all of you. And we're going to get your thoughts and your input. And we're going to build options for our church to advocate. And this isn't to impose, it's to invite. It isn't to take the power onto the working group, it's to empower the congregation collectively to do this. No one's going to be forced to do it, but we want to move toward action. And so this is the concrete step that we are taking to continue to build toward the kinds of solutions that clearly on this call, many of us are saying we want our church to be a part of. So we can certainly field questions there. And if LeAnn might want to share any thoughts just as the leader of this working group, as we get maybe a report at where we are right now, we can spend our final minutes doing that.
Yeah, I'm happy to do so. And we call ourselves the Anti-Racist Leadership Team. We are going to be starting a ministry, an anti-racist ministry, which is one of many ministries of WCC. It is not the ministry. It's not the most important ministry. It is one of the ministries of WCC. And my team members are Jean Ebersol, Greg Frizzados on the call, Mike Jacob, and Junia. And so we've got a really good group of people working on this. And let me try to share with you where we are. First of all, we come at this work with great humility. We don't have the answers. We are going to be along the way with you and everyone else, perhaps pivoting sometimes, going down a different direction. But what is at the core of our work is letting the Spirit lead. Where is WCC called to serve? As Jeff mentioned, what we are doing now, we're in the process of putting together a memo together for council, working with Jeff, because we want it to be clear. You all know and can appreciate this. When you start up a new group, you know, well, what's the group doing? Are they doing the work? What are they doing? We want to be very clear that we are just going to be the facilitators, that this is not committee work and we're doing the work. So we are in the process of putting together a memo for council that describes the scope of the leadership team's work and our initial thoughts about how the process should work. And this is at 15,000 feet up. There's no details yet because we're still working on that. And once we give that to council, we will start moving forward. But what we're thinking now, and this really, I love the way that these sessions are making sense and working. This work of the WCC's ministry is going to be small groups because that's the way to work through these issues. And we'll have phase 1, phase 2. Look at it this way. We are not putting together a corporate strategic plan. We're not doing that. We're putting together a broad outline for a ministry for WCC. And we call ourselves the leadership team because somebody's got to put something on paper. And so that's what we're going to do. So we ask all of you to keep us in your prayers. If you want to talk with any one of us about this work, please feel free to reach out. We would love to talk. But we're excited about moving forward. And, you know, to Lynn's comment and Marcy, we are called to do justice. That's what we are called to do in Micah, one of my favorite scriptures. And Christ was also very clear that we are to do justice. So while we need to talk about it, while we need to step off the curb, that's the hardest part, just to take that first step. That's what we are hoping to do with the grace of God and with the Spirit leading us.
We are at our time already. I want to thank LeAnn and Jeff for guiding us through this conversation today and last week as well. And also want to mention that we have had available for about a year an ongoing fluid list of resources, books, videos, action steps, and so on. And we will be updating it now based on some of the great resources that were suggested last week and today. And we'll make sure that that gets available to the entire congregation because this work is indeed ongoing. And so we need all the resources we can get. If you have any other additional resources, you can always put them in the chat now. It'll be open for a few more minutes, or you can always forward them to me, to Jeff, to LeAnn.
Thank you for
Thanks,
coming,
everybody.
everyone.
Okay, peace, everybody. Be well.
Thank you, LeAnn. Thank you, everybody.